The broken slave in a busy market on a distant planet. A crowd of alien species gathered around a small makeshift stage. The air was thick with the sound of haggling voices, loud and demanding. At the center of the chaos stood a woman, her body bruised and battered. Her wrists were shackled and her eyes, once full of hope, were now hollow and empty. She stood still, waiting as she had learned to do over the years. She was used to the jeering, the cruel comments and the mocking laughter, but nothing hurt more than the price tag that hung from her neck. "Only 10 credits for this one," shouted the auctioneer, pointing to the broken woman with a cruel grin. The crowd chuckled. Some even snickered as if she were nothing more than a worthless object to be sold and discarded. The woman tried to keep her head down, her long, tangled hair falling over her face, hiding the tears that threatened to fall. She had been through so much in her life, but today, this moment felt like the final blow. 10 credits. She was worth less than a meal, less than the cheapest piece of equipment. She could feel the eyes of the crowd upon her, sizing her up as if she were a broken tool, useless and expendable. No one here saw her as a person. As the auctioneer continued to call out bids, the alien woman's mind drifted to darker places. She had been a slave for as long as she could remember, sold from one cruel master to the next. She had been whipped, beaten, and starved. Her past was a blur of pain and fear, with only fleeting moments of kindness that were soon forgotten. Now she was standing here, her future uncertain and her heart heavy with despair. The crowd's laughter filled her ears. They didn't care about her suffering. They didn't care about the broken woman in front of them. She was just another piece of merchandise, ready to be bought and used. She wondered if anyone would ever see her as something more than that. Would she ever know what it felt like to be valued, to be treated with kindness, respect, or even love? 10 credits, do I hear 12? The auctioneer's voice snapped her out of her thoughts. Her gaze lifted for a moment, and for the first time she looked at the faces in the crowd. Some were alien, their eyes cold and indifferent. Others looked at her with hunger, as if she were a meal or a toy to be played with. There was no empathy here, no compassion. She saw no sign of hope in their eyes, only the desire to own her, to control her. Just as she lowered her head again, she noticed a figure in the back of the crowd, a human man. He was standing there quietly, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. Unlike the others, he wasn't laughing or staring at her like she was an object. He was watching the auction, but his gaze didn't seem to be filled with disgust or desire. It was something else. She couldn't quite place it. The auctioneer noticed him, and for a moment, there was a flicker of hesitation. Humans were rare on this planet, and the auctioneer wasn't sure if this human was just another rich tourist looking for entertainment, or someone with a genuine interest in buying. The man's eyes were fixed on her, but there was no excitement, no greed, just an intensity she couldn't explain. 10 credits, going once, going twice, the auctioneer called out, his voice rising with excitement. He had already gotten his payment. But something happened at that moment. The human stepped forward, his hand raised, and the crowd grew silent. 15 credits, the human said calmly, his voice steady and firm. The entire market seemed to freeze for a moment. No one expected him to make a bid, least of all for the broken slave who was worth so little. The auctioneer blinked in surprise, then smiled. 15 credits, a generous bid. Going once, going twice, why sold? The crowd murmured in confusion. Why would a human bid on her? Was he truly interested in such a broken thing? Or was he just playing some sort of game? The woman felt a strange wave of emotions wash over her. Surprise, confusion, and even a tiny spark of something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. The auctioneer handed her over to the human with a brief nod. The chains around her wrists were loosened, and she was free, at least for now. She didn't know where this man was taking her or why he had chosen her. But as she was led away from the market, the human turned to her and spoke for the first time. "You're not worthless," he said, his voice soft but clear. "I can see that." The woman didn't respond. Her mind was too overwhelmed with the events unfolding. She couldn't bring herself to believe it. No one had ever told her that before, and part of her didn't want to hope. But she couldn't help it. For the first time in her life, someone had seen her as something more than a broken slave. As they walked away from the market, the woman couldn't shake the thought from her mind. Was this truly a chance at freedom? Or was it just another cruel trick the universe had played on her? Her heart raced with uncertainty, but there was a glimmer of something she hadn't felt in so long: hope. And for the first time in years, she allowed herself to feel it. The human's first move. The sun dipped low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the streets as the human led the alien woman through the city. The streets were bustling with vendors selling all sorts of strange wares, and alien creatures moved about in every direction. But the human and the alien woman walked in silence. She kept her head down, too afraid to look up, her mind racing with questions. Who was this human? Why had he bought her? What was he going to do with her now? The chains around her wrists clinked softly with every step. She was free of the market, but she felt no freedom. Not yet. She had been bought and sold before, and each time the promise of freedom had turned into something much darker. But something about this human was different. He wasn't like the others. She risked a glance at him. He was walking just a few steps ahead, his back straight, his eyes scanning the crowd. He didn't seem to notice her watching him. But she noticed the way his face was set, like someone who had seen too much pain and yet still managed to carry on. His face was stern, but his eyes were kind. He wasn't looking at her as if she were a broken thing. He wasn't judging her like the others had. He was looking at her with something she couldn't quite understand: respect. They reached a small building at the end of a narrow alley. The door creaked as he opened it, and he motioned for her to enter. The woman hesitated. She was used to being locked away in dark, cold rooms, but this place was different. It felt almost warm. The soft light coming from within was inviting, not harsh like the fluorescent lights of the market. She could hear the sound of water running, the hum of machinery in the distance. It smelled faintly of herbs and wood. He stepped inside first, turning to hold the door open for her. "Come in," he said. His voice was calm, not commanding, but gentle. "You're safe here." Safe. The word echoed in her mind, and she couldn't help but wonder if it was real. She had never felt safe in her entire life. Not since she was taken from her home, from her family, so many years ago. She had only ever known fear and pain. But now, standing at the threshold of this strange building, she felt a flicker of something she couldn't name. It was like a spark in the darkness. She stepped inside, and the door clicked shut behind her. The human led her to a small room, with a bed covered in soft blankets and a table with a steaming bowl of soup on it. A fire crackled in the corner, its warmth a welcome relief from the chill of the night air. For a moment she was frozen, not knowing what to do. Her body felt so tired, so weak from years of suffering. But her mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. The human watched her silently for a moment, then walked to the table. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said, his tone steady and reassuring. "You can eat, sleep, and rest here. You don't need to worry about anything." The words were simple, but they hit her like a wave. She had been told countless times that she was nothing more than a tool to be used. People had always taken from her strength, her will, her body. But this human, he was offering her something she had never known: care, a choice. Her stomach growled loudly, and she realized just how hungry she was. The smell of the soup was intoxicating, and she reached out slowly, unsure of herself. She hadn't eaten anything decent in days. The human gave her a small, reassuring smile as she hesitated. "It's not poisoned," he said with a soft chuckle, as if sensing her fear. "Go ahead." Tentatively, she took a spoonful of the warm soup, and the taste flooded her senses, rich, comforting, and foreign all at once. It had been so long since she'd had anything like it, and for a moment she let herself enjoy the simplicity of the meal. She didn't know why she trusted him, but she did. It was as if something deep inside her had recognized that he was different from the others. As she ate, she couldn't help but watch him. He was sitting across from her, his gaze steady but not intrusive. He wasn't watching her like the others had, like she was a thing to be owned. He was simply there, offering her kindness without expecting anything in return. "Why did you buy me?" she finally asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Why me?" The question hung in the air, thick with the weight of her fear and confusion. She had to know. She had been bought before, but never like this. Never with the kindness she was now receiving. She had learned long ago not to trust but this human. He had shown her something that made her question everything. The human sighed, his expression softening. "I've seen people like you before," he said. "I've seen what they've done to you, and I couldn't just walk away, I had to help." The words hit her like a thunderclap, and for a moment she couldn't speak. No one had ever said that to her. No one had ever cared enough to help. But this human was different. He had seen her pain, her suffering, and instead of turning away, he had chosen to do something about it. She didn't know what to make of it, but for the first time in years, she felt something stirring inside her. A tiny flicker of hope. "Thank you," she whispered, not fully understanding the depth of her own words. "Thank you for seeing me." The human gave a small nod, his eyes sincere. "You don't have to thank me. You deserve to be seen." And for the first time in her life, she believed him. A glimpse of humanity. The days passed quietly in the small, unfamiliar home. It was a simple place, but there was warmth in every corner. The fire crackled steadily, filling the room with a soft, golden light. Outside, the winds howled, but inside, she felt an odd sense of peace. The human, whose name she learned was Elias, seemed determined to make her feel at ease. Every morning, he would leave early to work, and every evening, he would return with fresh food, often bringing small gifts that reminded her of kindness, something so foreign to her, a blanket, a piece of fruit, a new pair of shoes. He never asked for anything in return. She didn't know why he was doing it, but there was something about the way he treated her that made her believe he genuinely wanted to help. The alien, woman whose name was Elira, though she hadn't said it out loud in years, spent her time in quiet reflection. She sat by the window, staring out at the unfamiliar world beyond the small house. The people she had once known had sold her, tossed her aside like nothing more than a broken object. She had learned to survive, to never show weakness. But now with Elias she was learning something new, that there was kindness in the world. One afternoon, Elira was sitting on the floor, trying to braid her tangled hair, when Elias returned, early from his work. He smiled when he saw her, a warm, welcoming smile that made her heart skip a beat. He didn't know how deeply that simple gesture affected her. "I brought you something," Elias said, placing a small bundle on the table. It was a simple dress made of soft fabric. It wasn't much, but it was the first piece of clothing she had worn that didn't remind her of the chains she had once been in. She hesitated before standing up and walking toward him. Her hands shook slightly as she picked up the dress. The fabric felt soft against her fingers, so different from the rough, harsh clothing she had worn for so long. She held it against herself, unsure of what to do. "You don't have to wear it if you don't want to," Elias said, noticing her hesitation. "But I thought maybe it would make you feel better." Her breath caught in her throat. For the first time, someone was treating her like she was worth more than a tool to be used. For the first time, someone was offering her something with no strings attached. "I've never," Elira began, but her voice faltered. She had never had anyone care about her enough to do something like this. Elias sat down across from her, his gaze gentle but intense. "You don't have to say anything. You can take your time." Elira nodded, the words caught in her throat. She wanted to say something, to explain the pain she had carried with her for so long, but it was difficult. Her life had been a series of painful moments, and she had learned to keep those feelings buried deep inside. She wasn't sure how to express the gratitude she felt, and it made her feel vulnerable in a way she had never experienced. Instead of words, she just took a deep breath and slowly began to change into the dress. It was strange to wear something So soft, something that didn't restrict her movement or remind her of her former life. For a moment, she felt as though she could breathe for the first time in years. When she finished, Elias looked at her, his eyes widening slightly. "You look beautiful." The word hit her like a wave. Beautiful. No one had ever said that to her, not since she was a child, before everything had been taken from her. She had never considered herself beautiful. To her, beauty was something that belonged to others, not to someone like her. But now, with Elias's words, something shifted inside her. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Elias stood and walked over to her, his face serious. "You don't have to thank me, Elira. You're not broken, I see you. You're more than what they did to you. You're more than what anyone has ever made you feel." His words were soft, but they held a weight that she could feel deep inside her. They were like a balm to her wounded soul, something she hadn't realized she needed until now. He wasn't just giving her clothes, food, or shelter. He was giving her something far more precious, her dignity. For the first time in years, she felt seen. She felt like she mattered. But even as these feelings began to bloom inside her, doubts crept in. She had been hurt so many times before. She had been used, sold, discarded. Could she really trust him? Could she trust that this kindness was real and not just another cruel trick? But as she looked into Elias's eyes, she saw no malice. She saw no hidden agenda. There was only kindness, a quiet determination to help her, to give her something she hadn't had in so long: hope. "I don't know how to trust again," she admitted softly, her voice shaking slightly. Elias smiled, his gaze full of understanding. "You don't have to trust me all at once. Take your time. I'm not going anywhere." For the first time in her life, Elira allowed herself to believe it. Maybe, just maybe, there was a chance for her to have a life beyond survival. Maybe she could trust again. And in that moment, she realized something profound. She wasn't just a slave anymore. She was someone worthy of love, and maybe, just maybe, she could find it here, with Elias. A dangerous encounter. The quiet peace Elira had started to embrace was shattered one afternoon when Elias came home early, his face grim. He didn't look like the man she had come to. No, calm, compassionate, and patient. His shoulders were tense, his fists clenched. There was a storm brewing in his eyes, and Elira couldn't ignore the unease that began to settle in her chest. "Elias?" she asked cautiously, her voice trembling with uncertainty. "What's wrong?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he walked to the door, checking the locks, making sure everything was secure. His movements were deliberate, almost mechanical, and Elira felt her stomach tighten in response. Something was wrong, something serious. "They found us," he said quietly, his voice low but full of urgency. "I need you to stay here, Elira. Do you understand?" She didn't need to ask who they were. The fear in Elias's voice told her everything she needed to know. There were people, perhaps powerful people, who would stop at nothing to get what they wanted. People who saw her as a commodity, as property, just as she had been treated all her life. And now she was in danger once again. "I'm not leaving you," Elira replied firmly, standing up from the chair she had been sitting in. Her hands were trembling, but she couldn't bring herself to stay hidden. She had fought for her life before. She would do so again. Elias looked at her, and for a brief moment, his gaze softened. "I can't protect you if you're in the open. Please, stay out of sight. I'll take care of this." Before she could argue further, the sound of footsteps echoed outside the door. Heavy, deliberate footsteps that seemed to vibrate with menace. Elira's heart leapt into her throat. She moved toward the window and peeked through the blinds, her breath catching in her chest. A group of men were approaching the house, their faces shadowed beneath hoods, their movements precise and coordinated. They didn't look like ordinary thugs. They looked like soldiers, well-trained, with the kind of discipline Elira had seen in the worst of her captors. These were people who knew how to handle trouble. "I knew it wouldn't last," Elira whispered under her breath, her heart pounding in her chest. She had only just started to trust Elias, to believe that she was safe. Now it was all falling apart. But she wouldn't let herself be a victim again. She couldn't. Elias was already moving toward the door, his face hardening into a mask of resolve. He had known this moment would come. She could see it in his eyes now, the determination to protect her no matter the cost. "I'm not going to let them take you," he muttered, more to himself than to her. The door creaked open, and Elias stepped outside, leaving Elira behind. She couldn't stay in the shadows forever. She had to help, had to do something. She took a deep breath, her hands steadying as she grabbed the small knife Elias had left on the counter, just in case. It was nothing compared to what the soldiers had, but it was better than nothing. As Elira crept toward the door, her mind raced. Elias was out there alone, facing a threat he had known was coming, and yet he had still chosen to fight. For her. She could feel the weight of his sacrifice pressing down on her, and it filled her with a strange sense of determination. She had never been able to save anyone before. She had never even been able to save herself, but now for the first time she wanted to do something. Anything to help him. She reached the door just as Elias was talking to the men outside. The words were muffled, but she could hear the tension in the air. The soldiers weren't here to bargain. They were here for one thing. They wanted her. "We've been looking for her," one of the men said, his voice cold and unforgiving. "You've been hiding her long enough. Hand her over, and we'll be on our way. You don't have to make this difficult." Elira's heart raced. She could feel the anger swelling inside her, a force she had never allowed to surface before. They were here for her, to take her back to the life she had escaped, to sell her again, use her again. But she wasn't that person anymore. She wasn't the broken slave they thought they could control. Elias's voice was calm, but there was an edge to it. "She's not going anywhere, not with you." The men chuckled darkly. "You really think you can stop us, human? You're outnumbered. This doesn't have to end badly for you, but it will if you force our hand." Elias didn't flinch. "I'm not afraid of you." In that moment, Elira knew what she had to do. She couldn't stay in the shadows any longer. She had to stand up for herself, for Elias. She had to prove that she was worth saving. She took a deep breath, her fingers gripping the knife tightly, and slowly she crept toward the door. But just as she was about to step outside, a loud bang echoed through the air. The door was kicked open, and one of the soldiers lunged forward, grabbing Elias by the arm. The man was massive, towering over Elias, but Elias didn't go down without a fight. Elira's heart pounded in her chest as she watched Elias struggle. She couldn't let this happen. She wouldn't let it. With a burst of adrenaline, she charged forward, the knife held high. The soldier saw her coming too late. He turned just as Elira plunged the blade into his side. He grunted in pain, stumbling, back in surprise. The others hesitated for a moment, shocked by her sudden action. Elias took advantage of the distraction, swinging his fist into the soldier's face, knocking him to the ground. "Go!" Elias shouted, his voice urgent. "Get inside now!" But Elira didn't move. She stood there, heart racing as she watched. The soldiers regroup. They weren't going to stop. This wasn't over. The first real fight of her life had begun, and she wasn't going to lose. The human's true motive. The struggle outside lasted only moments, but it felt like an eternity. The soldiers had backed off, their wounded comrade left groaning in the dust, but Elira could see the cold calculation in their eyes. They were regrouping, preparing for something worse, something much more dangerous. Elias was out of breath, his knuckles bloodied from the fight, but he stood tall, his back straight as he faced them down. The flicker of fear that had gripped. Elira's heart had faded, replaced by a surge of adrenaline and something stronger. A deep burning need to protect what she had, to fight for something she had never believed she deserved. Elias's gaze locked onto hers, and she could see the determination behind his eyes. But there was something else too. Something that wasn't just about protecting her, but something deeper, more personal. His expression softened, and for a brief moment, Elira saw the weight of his hidden burden. The man who had chosen to save. Her to buy her freedom from the hands of others wasn't just doing this out of kindness. There was a reason, a painful, hidden reason. But what was it? The soldiers took a few cautious steps back, their hands resting on their weapons, but they didn't advance, they were waiting. And Elira, with the weight of the knife still heavy in her hand, knew this moment was far from over. Elias turned to her, a slight flicker of hesitation in his eyes. He motioned for her to step back, but she didn't. She stayed beside him, her body tense, her mind racing. She needed to know. She needed to understand why Elias had chosen to fight for her, a broken slave who had no more worth than a piece of discarded property. "You should go inside," Elias said softly, his voice steady but filled with a quiet urgency. "I'll handle this." But Elira shook her head. "No, Elias," she said, her voice trembling with a mixture of defiance and fear. "I won't hide. Not anymore." His expression hardened, and he met her gaze, his jaw tightening. "This isn't your fight. They're after you, not me." She felt the weight of his words sink deep into her chest. They had always been after her, hadn't they? She had always been the one to hide, the one who had no choice but to run and escape, to live in constant fear. But this time, for the first time, it was different. She wasn't just a victim anymore. She wasn't just a broken thing. She was something more. And Elias had shown her that, even when she had thought there was no hope left. "Why?" Elira asked suddenly, her voice cutting through the tension in the air. "Why are you helping me?" Elias froze, his back still to the soldiers, but his eyes shifted toward her. There was a deep pain in them, a pain that had been hidden behind his calm exterior. For a long moment, he didn't speak. The wind howled outside, but the air between them seemed to hold its breath. "I'm doing this because I can't let people like them have control over you," he said quietly, his voice almost a whisper. "Because I know what it's like to be helpless, to be trapped in a life where your choices are stolen from you. I've seen too many people suffer, and I couldn't let you suffer like that again." Elira blinked, confusion flooding her thoughts. "But you don't even know me. You don't owe me anything. Why? Why would you risk your life for someone like me?" Elias's gaze dropped for a moment, his expression hardening again, but there was no anger in his eyes, only sorrow. "Because I've been where you are, Elira. I know what it feels like to be trapped, to be forced into a life you didn't choose, to feel like you have no voice. I've been there, and I won't let you go through it alone. You're not just a slave. You're a person. You deserve a choice." Elira felt her heart tighten in her chest as the weight of his words sunk in. It wasn't just kindness that had led him to help her. It was something deeper, something he had carried with him, his own pain, his own history. He wasn't just rescuing her. He was fighting for both of them, for freedom, for a life without chains, without fear. The soldiers outside shifted again, and one of them stepped forward, his hand gripping the hilt of a blaster. "Enough of this," he sneered. "You think you can stop us, human? You're out of your league. Hand her over now, or things will get much worse for you." But Elira wasn't afraid anymore. Not of them. Not of the soldiers who thought they could control her. Not of the man who had risked everything for her. Her fear had been replaced by something stronger, something that felt like fire in her veins. "I won't go with you," Elira said, stepping forward, her voice steady and full of conviction. "I'm not your property. I'm not a thing to be sold, and neither is Elias." The soldier who had spoken sneered at her words, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. They hadn't expected this. They hadn't expected her to fight back. Elias looked at her, his eyes wide with surprise, but then a small, almost imperceptible smile tugged at the corner of his lips. For the first time, Elira saw the real reason he had been helping her. Not out of pity, but because he believed in her. He believed she was worth saving. "You're right," Elias said, his voice firm. "This is our fight, and I'm not backing down." And in that moment, Elira knew the truth. Elias hadn't just been saving her. He had been showing her how to save herself. The offer of a new life. The soldiers stood frozen, their weapons still raised but their hands trembling slightly as they watched Alira and Elias. The tension was palpable, hanging in the air like a thick fog, and for the first time Alira felt the full weight of the situation settle over her. The human and the broken slave standing together against those who had hunted her down were now in a standoff. But something had changed. Elias was no longer just trying to protect her. They were in this together, and the idea of standing side by side, not as protector and protected but as equals, ignited a fierce determination in her heart. Alira felt the ground beneath her shift, her own strength and power blossoming from the depths of the uncertainty she had carried all her life. No longer did she feel like the object they had once turned her into, the helpless being bound by chains. No longer did she feel like the one who needed saving. She was more than that. They had underestimated her. And now she had a choice. She could choose to fight. The soldier who had been speaking sneered at her words, but there was something hesitant in his expression. He had seen her fight back, seen the strength in her eyes. This was no longer just about taking a slave back, it was about facing something new, something unexpected, something that made them unsure. "You think you can stand up to us?" one of the soldiers said, his voice wavering as he took a step forward. "You think this will end well for you?" Alira felt her chest tighten with the weight of their words, but she didn't back down. The fear she had carried all her life, fear of being owned, of being hunted, of being thrown away, was no longer a part of her. She had a choice. And right now the choice was simple: to stay and fight for herself, for the first time in her life, or to fall back into the shadows of fear and hopelessness. She glanced at Elias. His eyes met hers, and she could see the question there. He had promised to protect her, but now it was her turn to stand beside him. She wasn't going to let him fight alone, not now, not when he had given her something she had thought was impossible. A future. Without a word, she nodded, her resolve set. "You're right," she said, her voice steady. "I'm not your slave. I'm not your property. I won't go back to that life, not to anyone." The soldiers hesitated for a moment, surprised by her confidence. They hadn't expected this from someone they had deemed nothing more than a broken tool. The realization hit them harder than any weapon could. Alira wasn't afraid of them. She had nothing to lose, and that made her dangerous. Elias took a step closer to her, standing shoulder to shoulder with her. His hand found hers, not in a protective gesture, but as an equal. He didn't see her as a slave. He saw her as a partner in this fight. "We're not asking for permission," Elias said firmly. "This is our choice. We're not going anywhere. Not today." The soldiers gripped their weapons tighter, their stance more aggressive. But Alira could see the uncertainty in their eyes now. They had come for her, expecting her to be a coward, a victim who would easily surrender. But they hadn't accounted for Elias's presence, or for Alira's own will to survive. For the first time, Alira realized something that shook her to her core. This fight wasn't just for survival, it was for her future. The life she had been forced to live wasn't the only path she had. Elias had shown her that. He had given her the freedom to choose. And now, she had made her choice. Before the soldiers could react, Elias stepped forward, his voice low but full of authority. "You don't get to decide what happens to us anymore. We're not your property. You can leave now, or we can make you." The threat was clear, but it wasn't in the words. It was in the way they stood together, united in a shared strength neither of them had fully known they possessed. The soldiers exchanged glances, unsure of how to proceed. They had expected fear. They had expected submission. But they had found something far more dangerous: resistance. And that, in their eyes, was something they hadn't planned for. The lead soldier stepped back, his face tight with frustration. "This isn't over," he growled, his eyes narrowing at both of them. "We'll be back, and you'll regret this." But Elias stood his ground, his eyes unwavering. "We'll be ready." The soldiers turned and retreated, their footsteps echoing into the distance, leaving behind only the sound of their heavy breathing. Elira stood there, her heart pounding. But something had shifted within her. She had just made a choice that could change everything. She wasn't going to hide anymore. Elias turned to her, his face softening. "You're strong, Elira. Stronger than I thought." Elira shook her head, her eyes meeting his with a quiet, confident smile. "I'm strong because I'm not alone anymore." For the first time, she realized that the life she had been living, the life she had thought was her only option, was just that, a life. It was a life she had outgrown. Elias hadn't just given her freedom. He had shown her that she could choose who she wanted to be. And now, for the first time in her life, she wasn't just surviving. She was living. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice full of emotion. Elias smiled, his eyes full of warmth. "No need to thank me. We've both earned this." And for the first time in her life, Elira truly believed it. She had earned this moment, this future, embracing her true worth. The morning light filtered in through the small windows, casting soft, golden rays across the room. Elira sat by the fire, her hands gently cradling a cup of warm tea, her eyes lost in thought. The events of the past days seemed like a blur, moments of fear, of anger, of uncertainty. But they were now behind her. The soldiers had gone, and, with them, the threat that had once loomed so large over her life. Yet as the quiet of the house settled in around her, Elira realized something. She wasn't afraid anymore. Not of the world outside, not of the people who had tried to break her. She wasn't a slave, she wasn't broken. The woman who had once believed she was worthless, destined to be cast aside and forgotten, was now something else entirely. She was free. And she was not alone. Elias entered the room quietly, as if trying not to disturb her. But when he saw her sitting there, a soft smile tugged at the corners of his lips. For the first time, Elira didn't look like the woman who had been sold for 10 credits at the market. She didn't look like the frightened, broken creature she had once been. She looked like someone with power, with purpose, someone who had reclaimed their life. "You look peaceful," Elias said, his voice warm but laced with a quiet curiosity. Elira looked up at him, her expression softening. "I feel peaceful," she said, her voice steady. It was a simple statement, but it was true. She had spent so many years fighting for survival, never knowing what it meant to just be, to live. But now, she felt a sense of calm she had never known. Elias sat across from her, his eyes searching hers as if trying to read her soul. "You've come a long way," he said quietly, his tone filled with a mixture of admiration and something deeper, something she couldn't quite name. Elira met his gaze, her heart swelling with a feeling she had never allowed herself to fully experience before. Gratitude. Not just for the protection he had given her, not just for the freedom, but for the trust he had shown her. For seeing her as something more than the slave she had been, something more than the broken woman who had no hope. For the first time, she saw herself as he saw her, not as a victim, not as a possession, but as someone worthy, someone deserving of respect, of love, someone who could choose her path. "I don't know how to thank you," Elira said softly, her hands trembling as they set the teacup down on the table. "You've given me so much, more than I could ever repay." Elias's expression softened, his gaze full of warmth. "You don't have to thank me, Elira. I didn't do it for thanks. I did it because I believe in you. I believe you deserve more than what the world tried to take from you." Elira's eyes filled with unshed tears, but they were different from the tears she had once cried. These were tears of release, of healing. She was no longer carrying the weight of her past alone. Elias had given her a gift she could never have imagined, the ability to see herself as she truly was, a person, not an object. And in that moment, she knew that no matter what the future held, she had already won. She had found her worth, Not in the eyes of others, but within herself. She had chosen to believe that she was worthy of a life beyond the chains of her past. "I've spent so long thinking that I wasn't worth anything," Illyra said quietly, her voice trembling slightly. "That I was nothing more than what they made me. But now, I'm beginning to understand. I'm worth something. I'm worth this life." Elias reached across the table, taking her hand gently in his. The gesture was simple, but it spoke volumes. He wasn't just protecting her anymore. He was giving her the space to be herself, to find her own way. "You always were worth something," Elias said softly, his voice full of sincerity. "I just helped you see it." The room was silent for a moment, the only sound the crackling of the fire. Illyra closed her eyes, taking in the peace that had settled over her. She wasn't running anymore. She wasn't hiding. She wasn't afraid. The world outside was still full of uncertainty, full of people who would never see her as anything more than a tool to be used. But she no longer cared. She knew who she was now, and that was all that mattered. She opened her eyes and smiled, the first real smile she had given in years. It was a smile of freedom, of acceptance. She wasn't just surviving anymore, she was living. "I think I'm ready," she said quietly, her gaze meeting Elias's. "Ready to build something new. A life. For both of us." Elias smiled back, his heart swelling with pride and something deeper, something unspoken but understood. "We'll build it together." In that moment, Illyra knew that she had found something more than freedom. She had found a future. And with Elias by her side, that future would be filled with choices, with possibilities, and with the kind of love that only comes when two people choose each other, not because they have to, but because they believe they are worth it. She wasn't just a broken slave anymore. She was a woman, a person with a future, and the world had no idea what was. Coming next.